On the morning of March 31st, 1995, the sun rose over Corpus Christi, Texas, just like any other Friday. But in room 158 of the Days Inn Motel, a storm was brewing, a storm that the world was not prepared for. It was a storm composed of obsession, desperation, and a betrayal so deep it felt like a Shakespearean tragedy played out in a cheap motel. At 11:48 a.m., a gunshot shattered the humid air. It was a single, deafening crack that signaled the end of an era. Moments later, a young woman in a green sweatsuit stumbled out of the room, clutching her right shoulder. She was running for her life. Behind her, another woman stood in the doorway, holding a revolver, screaming insults at the girl who was bleeding out on the pavement. The woman running was Selena Quintanilla-Pérez. At 23 years old, she was the Queen of Tejano music, a Grammy winner, a fashion icon, and the brightest star in the Latin music firmament. She was the girl next door who had just finished recording a crossover album, an album that was supposed to make her the next Madonna, the next Janet Jackson, the first global superstar of Mexican-American descent. By the time Selena reached the lobby of the motel, she was collapsing. Her last words were not a song, but a name. The name of the woman who had fired the bullet, the woman she had once called her sister, her confidant, and the keeper of her secrets. How does a life meant for greatness get cut short by the very person allowed to stand the closest? How does a story built on family, hard work, and kindness end on a blood-stained lobby floor? This isn't just the biography of a singer. It's a clinical study of how a bright light draws shadows that eventually grow long enough to touch. Selena wasn't just a victim of a crime, she was a victim of her own capacity to trust. She believed in second chances, in the inherent goodness of people, and in the loyalty of a devoted fan who had built a shrine to her in a dark apartment. The shock didn't just hit Texas. It fractured the heart of an entire continent. From the barrios of Los Angeles to the bustling streets of Mexico City, time stopped. Radio stations ceased their regular programming to play Como la Flor on a loop. Families who had seen their own dreams reflected in Selena's success gathered around televisions, weeping as if they had lost their own daughter. But to understand the bullet, you have to understand the journey that led to that motel room. You have to go back to the dust-blown towns of South Texas, to the smell of old upholstery in a traveling van, and to the iron-willed father who saw a miracle in his daughter's voice before she could even read. This is the story of Selena, a light so bright it still glows 30 years after the world tried to put it out. Prepare yourself. This is the truth behind the smile, the sequins, and the ultimate cost of a heart that was simply too open for its own safety. Selena was born in 1971 in Lake Jackson, Texas, a quiet town where the rhythm of life was dictated by the shifting tides of the Gulf and the steady hum of the local chemical plants. It wasn't a place that groomed superstars. It was a place of hard work, long summers, and humble expectations. But inside the Quintanilla household, there was a ghost that refused to rest. The ghost of a dream that had once belonged to her father, Abraham. In his youth, Abraham had been a singer with his own band, Los Dinos. He had tasted the edges of fame, only to see it slip through his fingers. Because the world wasn't quite ready for a Mexican-American group that didn't fit into a tidy box, he had eventually settled for a stable job to provide for his wife, Marcela, and their 3 children, A, B, Suzette, and the youngest, Selena. But the fire hadn't gone out. It had simply moved into his children's veins. The moment that changed everything happened when Selena was just 6 years old. Abraham was strumming a guitar in the living room, perhaps reliving one of his old songs, when Selena began to sing along. She didn't just mimic the words, she carried them. Her voice was small, but the clarity and the pitch were unmistakable. Most fathers would have smiled and moved on, but Abraham heard a second chance. He heard a future. He didn't waste time. He bought instruments the family could barely afford, transforming their quiet garage into a relentless boot camp of rhythm. While other children in Lake Jackson were playing under the Texas sun, the Quintanilla siblings were anchored to their equipment. A. B. was handed a bass guitar, Suzette was put behind a drum kit she initially hated, and Selena was placed in front, her voice becoming the centerpiece of a new incarnation of Selena y los Dinos. Abraham was a perfectionist. He demanded hours of practice every single day. He wasn't just teaching them music, he was teaching them survival. In 1980, he opened a Mexican restaurant called Papa Gallos. It featured a small stage where his children could perform for the customers. It was their first real venue, a place of warm food and the smell of sizzling fajitas, where the locals would pause their meals, mesmerized by the little girl with the giant voice. A girl who seemed to understand the weight of a ballad better than any adult in the room. But the American dream is a fragile thing. When the oil recession swept across Texas in the early 80s, Papa Gallos became a casualty. The restaurant failed, the family lost their home, and they were forced to pack their lives into a van and move in with relatives in Corpus Christi. They had nothing left but the instruments and each other. This was the crucible where the legend of Selena was truly formed. The family lived out of a dilapidated van they nicknamed Big Bertha. They traveled across the taco circuit, playing at weddings, quinceañeras, and roadside bars that smelled of stale beer and desperation. They were often paid in small bills and home-cooked meals. Selena learned early that an audience listens differently when they know you are hungry. She learned to read a room, to win over skeptical crowds with a smile that could melt the coldest heart, and to sing through the exhaustion of 12-hour drives. Abraham insisted she sing in Spanish, the language of their heritage, even though Selena spoke only English at home. He made her memorize the lyrics phonetically, teaching her to feel the words she didn't yet fully understand. In those dusty Texas bars, the little girl from Lake Jackson disappeared, and the Queen of Tejano began to emerge. She was becoming a voice for a community that had been waiting for someone to represent them, someone who was both American and Mexican, someone who was struggling just like they were. Selena wasn't just rising, she was being forged in the fire of necessity. But as the stages grew larger and the crowds grew louder, the shadows were also beginning to take shape. The family was tight-knit, a fortress against the world. But as history shows, even the strongest fortresses have a back door. In the 1980s, the world of Tejano music was a rugged, dust-caked landscape ruled by men. It was a genre defined by the squeeze of the accordion and the deep, masculine growls of singers who looked more like truck drivers than pop stars. The machismo culture was the unwritten law of the land. Promoters didn't just doubt women, they actively avoided them. They believed that a female singer couldn't sell records, couldn't draw a crowd to a dance hall, and certainly couldn't command the respect of a community built on traditional patriarchal values. Then came Selena. She was a teenage girl in sequins and spandex, standing on stages where the air was thick with the scent of diesel and cheap cologne. When she first started, the industry looked at her like a novelty, a little girl playing a man's game. But Selena wasn't playing. She was rewriting the rules. Her first major challenge wasn't just being a woman, it was being an American. Selena was the quintessential Generation 1.5. She spoke English as her first language, thought in English, and dreamed in English. To the purists in the Tejano world, she was an outsider trying to capitalize on a culture she didn't fully inhabit. But Selena turned her weakness into her greatest weapon. She practiced her Spanish lyrics until they became an emotional language, a bridge that connected her modern, pop-influenced sensibilities with the deep-rooted traditions of her fans. The breakthrough didn't happen in a glitzy studio. It happened in the trenches. Abraham Quintanilla, her father and manager, fought tooth and nail to get her on stage. He faced countless no's from promoters who told him to take his daughter home and let her be a housewife. But every time Selena opened her mouth, the no turned into a, "How much?" Her voice was a force of nature. It had the power of a gospel diva and the tenderness of a folk singer. In 1987, the tide finally turned. At just 15 years old, Selena won Female Vocalist of the Year at the Tejano Music Awards. It was a seismic shift. She hadn't just won a trophy. She had shattered a glass ceiling that had been bolted shut for decades. She became the first woman to dominate a genre that had tried its best to ignore her. But Selena didn't stop at just singing. She brought a visual revolution to the borderlands. She was heavily influenced by the global icons of the day: Madonna's daring, Janet Jackson's precision, and Paula Abdul's choreography. She began designing her own stage outfits: the high-waisted pants, the shimmering bustiers, the bold colors that popped against the dark, smoky backgrounds of the dance halls. She looked like a superstar from the future, performing music from the past. Young Mexican-American girls saw themselves in her. For the first time, they had a mirror. She wasn't a distant icon from Hollywood. She was one of them. She ate at the same taco stands, she spoke with the same accent, and she carried her heritage with an unapologetic pride that was infectious. The industry finally surrendered. By the late 80s, Selena was no longer just a rising star. She was the face of the movement. She was the Queen of Tejano, but the crown was starting to feel a bit small for her. She had conquered the machismo, she had united the generations, and she had proven that a young woman from Lake Jackson could command an army of fans. However, as her professional life reached a fever pitch, her personal life was about to enter a state of chaos. A new member was joining the band, a long-haired, rebellious guitar player who would bring both the greatest love of her life and the most intense conflict she had ever faced with her father. The rise was accelerating, but the internal foundation of the Quintanilla fortress was about to be tested like never before. As Selena's fame reached a crescendo, the walls of the Quintanilla fortress, carefully built and guarded by Abraham, began to feel a little too tight. Selena was no longer a child. She was a woman in her late teens, living a life of constant travel and high-pressure performances. In the small, cramped confines of their tour bus, Big Bertha, emotions were always amplified, and it was in this pressure cooker of music and family that Chris Perez entered the frame. Chris was everything Abraham feared. He was a long-haired, soft-spoken rock guitarist with a rebellious edge and a past that included a few minor brushes with the law. He didn't fit the clean-cut, family-oriented image that Abraham had meticulously crafted for Selena Quintanilla-Pérez. But Chris was also a musical virtuoso, and his arrival added a modern, rock-infused energy to Selena's sound that pushed the band into a new dimension. The connection between Selena and Chris didn't start with a lightning bolt. It grew in the quiet spaces between the noise of the tour. It was found in shared headphones on 12-hour drives, in late-night conversations about music and dreams, and in the unspoken understanding of two people who felt like outsiders even in their own lives. Selena, who had spent her entire life under the watchful eye of her father, found in Chris a sense of freedom she had never known. He didn't see the Queen of Tejano. He saw the girl who loved pepperoni pizza and dreamed of a simple life. But loving Chris meant lying to her father. For months, they lived a double life. They stole glances on stage and met in secret behind venues, always looking over their shoulders. The tension was suffocating. Selena was caught between the two men she loved most, the father who had sacrificed everything for her career and the man who made her feel like a person instead of a product. The secret inevitably shattered. In 1992, Abraham discovered the relationship, and the reaction was nuclear. To Abraham, Chris wasn't just a boyfriend. He was a threat to the family business, and the distraction that could derail the crossover dreams they had worked decades to achieve. In a fit of rage on the side of a Texas highway, Abraham fired Chris and threw him off the tour bus, telling him he was a cancer to the family. For the first time in her life, Selena was truly at odds with her father. She was devastated, but she wasn't defeated. She realized that as long as she stayed within the rules of the Quintanilla Empire, she would never be allowed to grow up. On April 2, 1992, Selena made the boldest move of her life. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't seek a blessing. She and Chris slipped away to a courthouse in Nueces County and got married in secret. The elopement was a declaration of independence. When the news broke, Abraham was forced into a corner. He realized that he could either lose his daughter forever or accept the man she loved. He chose the latter, but the scars of that conflict remained. Chris was brought back into the fold, but the dynamic had shifted. Selena had proven that she was no longer just a daughter to be managed. She was a woman with a will of her own. This period of her life was one of immense personal growth, but it also added a new layer of complexity to her inner circle. She had fought for her love and won, but the battle had left her vulnerable. She was looking for peace, for someone to handle the mounting pressures of her burgeoning empire so she could focus on the music and her husband. It was in this moment of success and transition that she opened the door to a woman who claimed to be her biggest fan, a woman who would offer her the loyalty she craved, only to use it as a weapon. By the early 1990s, Selena was no longer just a musician. She was becoming a phenomenon. She had moved past the stage of rising star and entered the stratosphere of cultural icon. This wasn't just because she could hit a high note or dance with effortless grace. It was because she represented something that had been ignored by the American mainstream for decades. She was the bridge between two worlds, the living, breathing embodiment of the bicultural dream. In 1992, she released the album Entre a mi mundo, which translates to Enter My World, and the title couldn't have been more prophetic. The lead single, Como la Flor, became her signature anthem. It was a song about heartbreak, but the way Selena performed it with a mixture of vulnerability and power turned it into something else entirely. It became the heartbeat of the Southwest. When that song played on the radio, people didn't just listen. They felt a surge of pride. For the Mexican-American community, Selena was the proof that their culture wasn't niche. It was universal. The validation from the industry finally culminated in 1994 at the 36th Grammy Awards. Selena arrived in a shimmering, white-beaded gown that she had designed herself. When her name was called for Best Mexican-American Album for Selena Alive, the room erupted. As she walked to the stage, flashing that radiant, million-dollar smile, she wasn't just accepting a trophy for herself. She was accepting it for every young girl in a Texas barrio who had been told her dreams were too big for her zip code. She was the first female Tejano artist to win the award, effectively ending the debate about whether a woman could lead the genre. But Selena's vision reached far beyond the microphone. She was a creator at heart. She opened Selena Quintanilla-Pérez, a series of boutiques in Corpus Christi and San Antonio that featured hair salons and her own fashion lines. She wanted to build an empire that celebrated the beauty of her people. She spent her days sketching designs and her nights on stage. She was a CEO, a designer, a wife, and a superstar, all while maintaining a humility that baffled the press. She'd still show up at local grocery stores, sign every autograph, and treat every fan like an old friend. This period was also the beginning of her most ambitious project, the English-language crossover album. This was the holy grail for the Quintanilla family, the dream Abraham had nurtured since the days of the garage rehearsals. Capital E.M.I. Latin knew they had a potential global superstar on their hands. They saw in Selena what the world would later see in Shakira or Jennifer Lopez, an artist who could transcend language barriers. She began recording tracks like Dreaming of You and I Could Fall in Love, pouring her soul into a language that was her first, yet felt like a new frontier in her professional career. The pressure was immense. She was carrying the expectations of an entire demographic on her shoulders. She was the face of Coca-Cola, the star of a Mexican telenovela, and the biggest name in Latin music. To the world, she looked invincible. She was the woman who had everything: the talent, the fame, the perfect marriage, and a family that stood behind her like a phalanx. But as her empire grew, so did the administrative burden. The fan club was exploding. The boutiques needed constant oversight, and the logistics of her life were becoming a tangled web. Selena, who saw the best in everyone, felt she needed someone dedicated, someone who lived for her success as much as she did. She needed a right hand. It was in this moment of peak visibility and exhaustion that a woman named Yolanda Saldívar made her move. She appeared not as a business rival, but as a servant, a woman who claimed her only goal in life was to protect Selena's legacy. In the bright, blinding light of Selena's success, no one noticed the shadow that Yolanda was casting. No one realized that the woman who was organizing the fan mail was also beginning to weave a web of control that would eventually turn Selena's sanctuary into a cage. Trouble rarely arrives with a warning. It doesn't often announce itself with a loud noise or a grand entrance. Most of the time, it enters through the back door, disguised as a helping hand, wearing a smile of pure devotion. For Selena, that disguise had a name: Yolanda Saldívar. Yolanda didn't come from the music industry. She wasn't a shark or a high-powered executive. She was a quiet, unassuming, registered nurse from San Antonio. To the world, she looked like anyone else. A short, middle-aged woman with a tidy appearance and a soft-spoken demeanor, but beneath that ordinary exterior was a mind that had found its singular, burning purpose in the form of a 20-year-old singer. The relationship began with a series of phone calls. Yolanda reached out to Abraham Quintanilla repeatedly, her voice filled with a desperate kind of passion. She insisted that Selena needed a fan club. She argued that a star of Selena's magnitude deserved a formal organization to connect with the thousands of young girls who worshipped her. At first, Abraham was hesitant, but Yolanda was persistent. She offered to do it for free. She promised to handle everything: the mail, the membership cards, the events, without asking for anything in return, except to be near the Queen. Persistence can look exactly like passion in the beginning. Abraham eventually relented, and Yolanda was given the green light. She delivered on every promise. Within months, the Selena fan club grew into one of the largest in the country, boasting over 1,500 members in its first year. Yolanda was efficient. She answered every letter, sent out autographed photos, and organized meet and greets. Selena, touched by this level of dedication, began to see Yolanda not as an employee, but as a motherly figure, a confidant who took care of the details so Selena could focus on the music. Slowly, the fan club president moved from the periphery to the center of Selena's life. When Selena opened her boutiques, she needed someone she could trust to manage the day-to-day operations. She turned to Yolanda. It seemed like a natural fit. Yolanda was promoted to manager of the boutiques, given access to the company credit cards, and handed the keys to the kingdom. But as Yolanda moved closer, the atmosphere around Selena began to change. It was a subtle shift at first, like the temperature dropping a few degrees when a cloud passes over the sun. Employees at the boutiques noticed that Yolanda was becoming intensely possessive. She appointed herself as the gatekeeper, screening phone calls, hiding mail, and deciding exactly who was allowed to speak to Selena. Then there were the rumors about Yolanda's home. Those who had been inside described it as a shrine. The walls were covered not just with Selena's posters, but with hundreds of photos. Many of them candid shots that Yolanda had taken in secret. There were candles lit in front of images of the singer, as if it were a place of worship rather than a residence. It was an obsession that bordered on the religious. But Selena, kind to a fault, brushed it off as extreme loyalty. The warning signs were there, blinking in the dark. Martín Gómez, the talented fashion designer who worked closely with Selena, was among the first to feel the sting of Yolanda's malice. He saw her temper, her manipulation, and the way she would sabotage anyone who threatened her special connection with the star. He eventually told Selena plainly, "Something is wrong with this woman. She is unstable. She is dangerous." But Selena lived by a different code. She believed that if you were good to people, they would be good to you. She viewed Yolanda's intensity as a byproduct of her hard work. She couldn't conceive of a world where someone who claimed to love her so much would want to harm her. She was the sun. And she didn't realize that when you shine that brightly, you don't just light up the world. You also blind yourself to the shadows lurking just out of sight. The shadow in the closet was no longer just a fan. She was a gatekeeper, and she was about to turn the sanctuary Selena had built into a trap. The illusion of loyalty is a fragile thing. And by early 1995, the cracks in Yolanda Saldívar's facade were no longer possible to ignore. The first tremors didn't come from inside the boutiques, but from the fans, the very people Yolanda was supposed to serve. The phones at Q Productions began to ring with a disturbing frequency. Parents were calling from all over the country, confused and angry. They had sent in their hard-earned money for fan club memberships, for t-shirts and signed photos. But months had passed, and they had received nothing in return. Abraham Quintanilla, ever the protective architect of the family business, began to listen. He wasn't just a father, he was a man who understood that in the music industry, your reputation is your currency. When he looked into the books of the fan club and the boutiques, what he found was a financial wasteland. Over $30,000 was simply gone. There were forged signatures, altered bank statements, and a trail of canceled checks that led directly to Yolanda's personal accounts. On March 9, 1995, the confrontation finally happened. Abraham summoned Yolanda to the family's corporate headquarters. He sat her down in front of Selena and her sister, Suzette, and laid out the evidence. It was a moment of absolute clarity. Abraham didn't just accuse her, he showed her the numbers. He told her she was a thief and a liar. He demanded an explanation for the missing funds and the disappointed fans. But Yolanda's reaction wasn't one of guilt or apology. It was a cold, robotic denial. She sat there, staring blankly, repeating the same phrases over and over. She had lost the receipts. The bank had made a mistake. Someone else was trying to frame her. For Selena, watching this was like watching a mirror shatter. This was the woman she had invited into her home. The woman who had cried on her shoulder. The woman she had defended against everyone's warnings. Selena was devastated. But even in the face of theft, she struggled to be cruel. She wanted to believe there was a mistake, but the betrayal went deeper than money. Yolanda had been keeping secrets. She had stolen more than cash. She had stolen documents, bank records, tax papers, and sensitive business files that Selena desperately needed for the upcoming year. Without these papers, Selena's boutiques were in legal jeopardy, and her financial standing was a mess. Abraham fired Yolanda on the spot, telling her to stay away from his daughter and his business. But the architect of deceit had one final move. She knew that Selena's kindness was her greatest vulnerability. Yolanda didn't disappear. Instead, she retreated into the shadows, holding onto the stolen documents like a hostage. She began a campaign of psychological warfare, calling Selena constantly, crying, claiming she had been assaulted in Mexico, using every ounce of pity she could manufacture to lure Selena back into her orbit. Selena was caught in a nightmare. She needed those documents to move forward with her life, her business, and her crossover album. But more than that, she wanted closure. She wanted to believe that the woman she had trusted wasn't a monster. Against the advice of her father and her husband, Selena agreed to meet Yolanda one last time to retrieve the papers. She believed she could handle it. She believed that a final act of kindness could resolve the chaos. She didn't realize that Yolanda wasn't looking for a resolution. She was looking for an end. She had already purchased a .38 caliber Taurus revolver. She had already practiced at a shooting range. The woman who had built a shrine to Selena was now preparing to sacrifice her at its altar. The trap was set, and the person Selena needed protection from was the only person she was walking toward. The morning of March 31st, 1995, didn't feel like a day of ending. It was a humid Friday in Corpus Christi, and Selena had every reason to look toward the future. Her crossover album was nearly finished. Her boutiques were expanding, and she was finally taking back the reins of her life. But there was one last piece of unfinished business. The missing documents still held by Yolanda Saldívar. Selena arrived at the Days Inn motel alone. She had spent the early hours of the morning taking Yolanda to a local hospital, after Yolanda claimed she had been assaulted during a recent trip to Mexico. It was a final, desperate lie designed to play on Selena's compassion. And it worked. Even though the doctors found no evidence of an assault, Selena didn't lash out. She brought Yolanda back to room 158, still hoping to simply get the papers and leave. Inside the cramped motel room, the air was stagnant. Selena demanded the remaining financial records. Yolanda, backed into a corner of her own making, finally realized that the special connection she had forged through manipulation was over. Selena was leaving. The gatekeeper was being evicted from the kingdom. As Selena turned to walk out the door, Yolanda reached into her purse and pulled out a .38 caliber Taurus Model 85 revolver. She didn't hesitate. She fired once. The bullet struck Selena on the right shoulder, severing a major artery. The impact was devastating, but the adrenaline of survival took over. Selena didn't collapse in the room. She ran. She burst through the door and sprinted across the parking lot toward the motel lobby, clutching her chest, leaving a trail of blood that stretched for nearly 400 feet. Behind her, Yolanda followed, waving the gun and screaming insults at the dying woman. It was a scene of incomprehensible cruelty. Selena collapsed on the lobby floor in front of the horrified motel staff. Her last words were a final act of justice. When asked who had shot her, she gasped out, "Yolanda, room 158. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was slipping away. At 1:05 p.m., at Corpus Christi Memorial Hospital, the heart that had beat for millions finally stopped. Selena Quintanilla-Pérez was gone. While the doctors were fighting for Selena's life, a different drama was unfolding back at the motel. Yolanda had retreated to her red pickup truck, holding the gun to her own head. For the next 9.5 hours, the world watched a televised standoff. It was a bizarre, haunting spectacle. The woman who claimed to love Selena the most was now the woman the entire world hated. The news of Selena's death hit the Latin community like a physical blow. It wasn't just a news story, it was a generational trauma. In Texas, the radio waves went silent as DJ. It broke down in tears mid-broadcast. In Los Angeles, thousands of people dropped what they were doing and drove to the streets, playing her music at full volume. The grief was communal. Families gathered in their living rooms, clutching portraits of Selena, unable to process how a life of such vibrant color could be extinguished so abruptly. The broader American media, however, was caught off guard. Major networks struggled to understand why people were mourning this regional singer, with the same intensity usually reserved for presidents or world leaders. They didn't realize that Selena wasn't just a singer. She was the proof of existence for millions of people who had never seen themselves reflected in the mainstream. Her death forced America to confront the sheer scale of the Latin population it had long ignored. As the sun set on that tragic Friday, the Queen of Tejano became a martyr. The girl from Lake Jackson had finished her final song, but the echo was just beginning. The world was about to see that while you could kill the singer, you could never silence the voice. They buried Selena on April 3, 1995, in a sea of white roses. Over 60,000 people arrived in Corpus Christi to say goodbye, forming a line that stretched for miles under the Texas sun. It was one of the largest funerals in American history, a staggering outpouring of love for a woman who was only 23 years old. But as the casket was lowered, something miraculous began to happen. The voice that had been silenced in room 158 didn't fade. It began to amplify. The crossover album Selena had worked so hard to finish, Dreaming of You, was released posthumously in July 1995. It didn't just sell, it shattered the ceiling. It debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200, making Selena the first Latin artist to ever achieve that feat. America, which had been slow to recognize her while she was alive, fell in love with her in her absence. Songs like I Could Fall in Love and Dreaming of You became the soundtrack of a new era, proving that the language of the heart has no borders. But Selena's legacy is measured in more than just chart positions. She became a cultural awakening. 2 years after her death, a young, then unknown dancer named Jennifer Lopez portrayed her in a biopic that introduced Selena to a global audience. The film didn't just tell her story, it immortalized the Selena look, the red lipstick, the shimmering jumpsuits, and the unapologetic pride in being Mexicana. Today, 30 years later, Selena is more relevant than ever. She has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. She has her own MAC makeup collections that sell out in minutes. Her image is emblazoned on everything from t-shirts at Target to murals in the streets of San Antonio. But for the Latin community, she is more than a brand. She is a symbol of possibility. She remains the proof that you can be working class, you can be bicultural, you can be kind, and you can still conquer the world. Her song Como la Flor has become a prophecy. Como la flor, cantan tu amor, me diste tu, se marchi tu, which translates to, like a flower, with so much love, you gave to me, it withered. The flower may have withered on that March morning, but the seeds she planted have grown into a forest. You can hear her influence in every Latin artist who crosses over today. From Becky G to Camila Cabello, to Selena Gomez, who was named after her, they all stand on the stage that Selena built with her own 2 hands. And the sweat of those long bus rides in Big Bertha. Selena's story ends early, but it doesn't end small. She left at 23, an age when most of us are just beginning to figure out who we are. Yet she lived with the certainty of a woman who knew her purpose was to bridge the gaps between us. She taught us that greatness doesn't require a long life, only a meaningful one. She taught us that trust is a gift, even if it's sometimes met with betrayal, and that kindness is a strength that outlasts any bullet. To anyone who has ever felt like an outsider, to anyone who has ever been told they have to choose between their heritages, Selena stands as your guardian. She reminds us that your roots are your power. She reminds us that the brightest stars don't just light up the sky. They guide the rest of us home. Selena Quintanilla was the girl from Lake Jackson who sang for the world, but she will forever belong to the people. Her light didn't go out, it just became the sun. And as long as someone, somewhere, is dancing to a cumbia or whispering the lyrics to a love song in the dark, Selena is still here. She is still smiling, and she is still dreaming. Selena's journey is a testament to the power of a single life to change the course of culture. She gave us her voice, her joy, and her heart, and the world is a brighter place because of it. If Selena's music has ever inspired you, or if her story has touched your life in a personal way, please share your memories in the comments below. What was the first song of hers you ever heard? How do you think she would have changed the world if she were still with us today? If you want to continue exploring the lives of the icons who broke barriers and shaped the music we love, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We're committed to telling these stories with the depth and respect they deserve. Thank you for staying with us to honor the legacy of the Queen. Until next time, keep the music playing.